welcome to tonight's Drone Talk, the first in a continuing series of webinars by AOPA's Pilot Protection Services. Tonight's talk is about drones and the legal landscape. We've got a great panel tonight. Let me introduce them. First of all, I'm Chad Mayer, an attorney with the Legal Services Plan. To my right is Jared Allen, the Legal Services Plan Senior Attorney.
Thank you, Chad. Good evening.
Thanks, Jared. Good evening, Justin. This is Justin Barkowski, our Director of Regulatory Affairs for AOPA.
Good evening. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Justin. We appreciate you being here. To Justin's right is Swain, our Senior Director of UAS Operations here at AOPA.
Nice to be here with you guys tonight.
All right, thanks, Kat. Well, we've got a lot to cover. It's an exciting, ever-evolving state of affairs in terms of drone law. We're going to be covering everything tonight from insurance to medical certification requirements, from UAS registration to airspace waivers, and especially focusing in on why AOPA is in the drone space, and Kat will address that in a moment. Keep in mind you can subscribe to AOPA's YouTube channel for lots of good content in the future, and throughout the course of this webinar during the live broadcast, you can ask questions in the chat window through the YouTube live chat feature. If you're not watching this live, you can call in 800 USA AOPA. And Kat, please let us know, why is AOPA in the drone space?
Yeah, we get that question quite a lot, and we're not new to the drone space. We've been around the drone space for quite many years with the development of Part 107, and with the implementation of 107 this past year, it really brought it to the forefront that UAS is part of general aviation, and AOPA is a leading organization of general aviation and manned aircraft. It's a perfect opportunity for us to step up and kind of give those benefits that we've been doing so wonderfully for the past several decades to our manned population, to our unmanned population, whether it's safety and education, or like we're here tonight talking about the legal services plan.
All right, thanks, Kat. That's a great overview. Let's start off tonight discussing the differences between hobby and commercial operations in the realm of UAS. Kat, what can you tell us about that?
Definitely. This is an area where there's still a lot of confusion because of the fact that there's a special rule for model aircraft that's been around for quite a long time. It's actually public law. A lot of modelers have been used to this and have been flying under these guidelines for many, many, many decades and have been doing so successfully. Some of those are flying strictly for hobby or recreational use and following a CBO. And what that stands for is a community-based organization. And that organization has to follow nationwide programming. So when I'm talking about a CBO, I can't just say, hey, it's a group of individuals like the four of us going out and flying drones and saying that we're a community flying recreational. We actually have to have nationwide programming set up. And there are organizations out there that provide that kind of benefit and support for the recreational and hobbyist community. So you do have to follow those guidelines that we have up there if you're going to be following and flying under the special rule. However, you can, as a hobbyist and recreational user, fly under Part 107 that was implemented last summer. So that a lot of confusion because people think 107 is strictly for commercial use. However, as a hobbyist, if you choose to, you can fly under Part 107 and follow the regulations of Part 107. Now, commercial operators are regulated and have to fly under Part 107 and follow those guidelines and operating limitations.
All right, thanks, Kat. That's a lot of good information. Justin, what can you tell us about other ways to fly as a hobbyist?
Well, I mean, you can fly under the special rule for model aircraft, under 107. I mean, those are obviously the two main things that we're looking at.
Yeah, and there used to be a lot of talk about 333 exemptions. Are those still in play, or do you have to just choose 107 or hobbyist now?
Well, right now, the 333 exemption is pretty much being phased out. There are certain limited circumstances in which you can use that, but by and large, your kind of rank and file, your average hobbyist is going to be flying under the special rule for model aircraft or a Part 107, and I would encourage one of those two because Section 333 is for very limited uses, and you can check out the FAA's website. They have more information for that, but it's only going to be in very limited applications.
All right, thanks. Good info there. And what about an in-between case where an operator may film something, for example, as part of a hobby drone flight, but later find that it might have a commercial application? Jared, what can you tell us about that?
Sure, Chad. So in those circumstances, and this is a question we see quite frequently in the Legal Services Plan, what the FAA has already commented on is that in those cases where a hobby or recreational user may have conducted a flight and then after the flight recognize that they might have captured something interesting, perhaps something newsworthy, that they then decide to sell that film or video to a local news agency, for example, the FAA has said that they're going to look at the primary intention of that operator concerning that flight. So for example, if prior to that flight, the operator had absolutely no intention of conducting a commercial operation or capturing film for the purpose of selling it, for example, the FAA would likely not find that to be a commercial operation that requires something like a Part 107 remote pilot certificate, or, as Justin was just mentioning, an exemption under Section 333. Now, however, if the FAA finds that that individual has done this repeatedly in the past, well, that's obviously going to be a circumstance where the FAA is going to look at it a little bit closer. But the takeaway is that if the intention to sell or otherwise distribute the material that you gathered during your UAS operation, if prior to that flight you had no intention of selling anything, you should be okay.
All right, very good. Thanks, everybody. It's a great recap of information about how to operate. But before you even take off in your drone, what about registration? It seems like this area of law is changing.
Yeah, so for a while there, everyone had to register, regardless of why you were operating or what kind of unmanned aircraft you had. Recently, back in May, there was a court case called Taylor v. Huerta that changed the rules in this area. So before you start flying, you really want to think about now, why are you operating? And if you do fall within the special rule for model aircraft, you are flying as a hobbyist, you do not have to register, and that was really the result of that court case. So if you are operating under the special rule for model aircraft, you do not need to register. But if you're any other purpose, you will have to register. So that's kind of your threshold question. Another thing to think about is whether or not you have to do it a paper application or an online application. A paper application you would use if your unmanned aircraft weighs more than 55 pounds, if you want to be using it outside the country. Those are kind of the most common reasons why you'd use a paper application. But otherwise, you can do it on the FAA's website. It's pretty straightforward. Another thing to know that the registration certificate will be valid for 3 years. You will have to renew it at that point in time and re-register. There are penalties, of course, if you do not register it, so keep that in mind. They are criminal and regulatory penalties. So obviously, you do want to register that thing before you fly it.
Certainly. Thanks for that good information. We'll be discussing FAA investigations that might implicate those sorts of things a little later on in the webinar. So after the registration recap, we all know how to do that now. Let's move on to another common question, which is medical qualifications to operate a UAS. Jared, what can you tell us about those?
Sure, Chad. So at the outset, the initial thing to note is that neither hobby or recreational users operating under Section 336 nor Part 107 remote pilot certificate holders are required to hold a first, second, or third class medical certificate issued under Part 67, and those are the certificates that most manned pilots hold. Now, when it comes to those individuals who may be operating under a Section 333 exemption, you need to look at the conditions and limitations of that exemption, because many of those do require a pilot certificate or a medical certificate, so do be aware of that. Now, concerning those Part 107 operators, there is a regulation under Part 107, which is 107.17, which generally states that no one can act as a remote pilot in command, a visual observer, directly participate in the operation, or even manipulate the controls of that UAS if they know or have reason to know of any condition, either physical condition or a mental condition, that would interfere with their ability to safely operate the UAS. So you do have to comply with that regulation, and the FAA has stated in a comment to that rule that if you as the individual have concerns or questions about your ability to comply with those regulatory requirements, you can consult with your physician about your mental or physical health. Now, on that note, I will also add that if you are someone who was previously involved in aviation and perhaps you had a Part 67 medical certificate that had been revoked, suspended, or your most recent application was denied, or you had a special issuance authorization withdrawn, that is not going to necessarily preclude you from flying UAS. However, again, if you're flying under Part 107, you would have to comply with 107.17. And if that condition is such that it really would interfere with your ability to safely operate the UAS, that could raise a problem. But just because you did have a prior issue with that medical certificate, it's not an outright bar to flying under Part 107.
Let me Ask you a question about that. So as a Part 61 pilot, I get this quite a lot. So let's say I haven't had a certificate that's been revoked, a medical certificate. However, I've let mine lapse. So I haven't flown, I'm a rusty pilot, let's say. And let's say after that period, I have a medical condition that arises. And let's say whether it's a surgery or something else that goes on, and I feel that I'm fine, but do I need my doctor to say that I'm fine in order to go fly UAS?
No, I mean under Part 107, it is the obligation of the airman or the remote pilot to make that determination whether they are safe to fly. Now, as I mentioned, the FAA has added that if you have any doubts about it, you can consult with your physician, but at the end of the day, it's going to be that individual that's responsible for ensuring that they comply with the medical requirements under Part 107.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Kat. That was a great question. Thank you, Jared. A lot of good info there. We'll be right back with you after a quick break, sponsored by AOPA's Pilot Protection Services. Keep in mind you can ask questions in the live chat during the original broadcast of this webinar. We'll be right back with you.
I'd had a cardiac event in 2000, and when I called AOPA Pilot Protection Services and talked to medical, the lady there, Mary Ann, was just fantastic. I sent the information I had. She emailed me back a 3-page thing showing me she prepared me for everything that I had to do. And I went down and I got through it. I couldn't believe it, you know. I was thrilled.
Welcome back from the break. Remember that you can ask questions in the live chat throughout the original broadcast of this webinar. You're watching Drones in the Legal Landscape, brought to you by AOPA's Pilot Protection Services. Next up, we're going to be talking about insurance. Leading that discussion will be Kat Swain, who has a long history, many years of experience in that industry, and she'll have a lot of great info for us. Kat, what can you tell us about your background and about drones as they relate to insurance?
Yeah, definitely. I grew up in an insurance household with a dad that worked a 35-year career in insurance, and I think that kind of rolled on to me, and so I entered my career in the insurance world for almost 15 years, working in various underwriting and claims backgrounds. So pretty extensive between aviation and insurance. So that's really what I want to talk to you guys about tonight. It's so important to make sure that you understand your policy wording when it comes to what is covered and what is not in UAS flying. There's a lot of misconceptions out there. A lot of people think automatically that if they have a homeowner's or a renter's policy that they're covered and that they're protected and that they have if there's any liability concerns, that policy will protect them. What I urge you to do is make sure you read your policy. A lot of people call their agent or call their direct writer and ask questions, which is really good, but I always say get it in writing as well. So some of the things that you're looking for when you're looking at your homeowner's insurance is looking at the actual policy wording. And when you're looking at the definition of, let's say, an aircraft, a lot of policies will state aircraft is a manned aircraft and does not include model or hobby drones. So for that case, a lot of the liability would be covered and would be broadly covered for you under those policies. Again, like I always state, get it in writing. Make sure you know what you're covered and what you're doing. Now, if you are a commercial operator, that's where it kind of draws the line, and you're not really looking at coverage anymore on your homeowners and your renters policy. It's that point where you need to start looking at coverage elsewhere, because most homeowners and renters policies have exclusions for business purposes. So if you're going to be flying for business, that's not going to be covered under your homeowners or your renters type policies and the liability that kind of flows through them. Also, when you're looking at things like privacy, that's a big concern in the drone space right now. Sometimes privacy can be covered. It depends on how privacy is defined in your policy, and sometimes can be defined under personal injury. However, again, there could be exclusions because of the way the policy is worded. It's the lovely world of insurance, so you need to make sure that there's no exclusion. So if let's say privacy is covered, that there's no additional exclusions for, let's say, an intentional act of what you're doing, hopefully not, or if you're doing any type of business pursuit, or again, if aircraft is defined and does include model aircraft and hobby. So a lot of things to look for, a lot of confusion. That's why I always say call, make sure you're having those kind of conversations with them, and then also getting that in writing from your agent or your direct writer. Now, at AOPA, we have a great resource, which is our AOPA insurance agency that provides those benefits and services to our membership, and one of those is commercial UAS insurance. A lot of these policies are quite wonderful. They have no exclusions, so they're covering everything from privacy all the stances of liability and really protecting you in your operation as a commercial operator.
Thanks, Kat. That's a lot of good info. I want to ask one thing further on that. Those of us from the manned aircraft world, may be familiar with insurance policies having a distinction between who's a named pilot, but then who's a named insured. Do we see that same distinction in terms of UAS insurance?
They're very similar in UAS insurance, so there's not much difference between the way that the manned policy is written and the way that the unmanned policy is written, except for the fact that the unmanned is being, I will say, a lot generous in what they're covering versus the manned side of the world.
Okay, thanks, Kat. That's all very good info.
Absolutely, and Kat, I can't stress one of your points enough, and that is read your policy, because that is a very common issue we see at the Legal Services Plan, is about questions as to what does my policy cover and what does it not cover. And you simply can't assume that every policy is going to have the same language, even if they're from the same insurer. So always read your policy, and like Kat mentioned, if you do need to have a change to that policy, sometimes getting in and writing in an email isn't even enough. You really want to have your policy amended or have an additional endorsement to reflect that change that you've agreed upon. So certainly keep that in mind.
There's a lot of our members, obviously, that both fly manned and unmanned, and so they have their manned airplane policy. And I think it's important to stipulate that coverage does not transfer 9 times out of 10 to your commercial UAS or your hobbyist UAS that you're going to be flying. So when I'm specifically talking about your manned aircraft policy. So make sure that you're aware and that you have the proper coverage.
All right, thanks. That's a lot of great info, breaking down a complex topic so we can understand it. And we're going to be moving on now to another complex topic, and that's airspace authorizations and waivers, a rich area. Justin, what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we can start with when you do not need an airspace authorization. So right now, if you're flying under 107 and you're operating near a Class Gulf or a Class G airport, uncontrolled airport, you do not need any particular authorization. However, if you're operating under 107 and you do want to fly in controlled airspace, you do need an authorization from the FAA. And the FAA has pretty clear instructions right now on their website on how you go about getting that authorization. Right now, they're currently processing them. They try to represent at least within the 90 days. That's the current time frame. Waivers are a little bit different. Waivers are if you're trying to operate outside of the current operating restrictions that are imposed upon you under 107. So, that you can't fly at nighttime, you can't fly beyond visual line of sight, you can't fly over people. These are certain restrictions that exist now, but you can get a waiver if you apply to the FAA, represent what your safety mitigations are going to be and how you're going to do it, and then they might actually grant it. So right now there's actually been well over 1,000 waivers granted thus far. A large majority of them, I think close to 1,000, have been for nighttime operations. So those are becoming more and more common, and those are pretty easy to get. If you want to fly over people, if you want to fly beyond visual line of sight, those are very kind of tough to get right now. There's only been a few of them granted. So those are kind of two different things that we're really looking at here. And I know there's, for airspace authorizations, there's a new program called LANCE that everyone's really talking about. LANCE is the Low Altitude Authorization and Notification Capability. That's what it means. It's one of these many acronyms that the FAA has. But LANCE is a program that really promises to provide quicker airspace authorizations. So if you want to fly in controlled airspace, I know people are losing a lot of jobs because they can't get these authorizations in time. So LANCE is hopefully going to speed up that process, getting the private sector involved. Hopefully you can get that authorization, I think, within 1 day.
That's one of the biggest questions that I hear at our fly-ins, phone calls that I get from our members is, Kat, I'm trying to run my business. I'm a 107 operator. I'm doing everything that I need to do, but these authorizations take so long to get. So what is so great about LANCE is they're beta testing it right now. When the beta fully runs, we're looking at about 10 ATO, or Air Traffic Control Organization facilities, which encompass about 50 airports. So that's good news for the 107 operators out there that really want to get this authorization done. And like Justin shared, it's a simple process. There's 2 vendors right now that are beta testing this type of app. You can actually do it out in the field, and it's a simple 3-step process of making sure that you input your information, basically your kind of flight plan information, the information of where you want to fly, and then allowing that to submit off to the service provider and to the FAA for that instant authorization.
Yeah, and one thing to add to that, the UAS facility maps, which we haven't mentioned, the FAA has put out hundreds of these things for all the different controlled airspace areas, and really it tells you where you're most likely to get an authorization from the FAA. So if you are trying to get an authorization, highly recommend you consult that map as a starting point and making sure that you're within kind of their approved altitudes. Another thing I'll add just briefly is that the FAA has told us several times now that they're committing a lot of resources to accelerating the approval of waivers and airspace authorizations. I think they're hearing from people that this is taking too long. So I think there's at least the dedication from the FAA to try to fix that.
All right, thanks, Justin and Kat. A lot of great info, and good to hear that this is accelerating and becoming more efficient as a process from the FAA. Next up, we're going to be moving to understanding the patchwork of laws. And flying a drone in certain airspace or certain locations, you may be dealing with FAA regulations as well as state and possibly even local regulations. It can get quite complicated. Jared, what can you tell us about that?
Certainly. So when it comes to this present issue, many of us are familiar with the fact that Congress, through many federal statutes, has given broad authority to the FAA to regulate the national airspace system, everything from air traffic control to navigation to safety. And so even though there are many federal laws and regulations that govern the national airspace system and aviation, there are still some very limited circumstances in which state and local governments can pass their own rules or regulations concerning aviation, particularly in cases where the federal government did not or did not intend to regulate the area or has laws or regulations that don't conflict with the state or local government's rules. Now, the FAA has already published guidance to the states that identify a few carve-outs of areas that are traditional in nature, in that the state and local governments would typically have laws about these topics. So we're talking about things such as privacy issues, local law enforcement's use of UAS, and use of UAS for things like hunting and fishing. Now, a hot topic right now in the unmanned aircraft world is that many states and local governments have passed their laws that go well beyond these very limited carve-outs and are in fact issuing laws or regulations about the actual operation of UAS, things like altitude restrictions or requirements for registration. Now, in fact, there was a very recent case up in Massachusetts where a federal district court judge in the case of Singer v. City of Newton found that the city's ordinances, which imposed requirements such as registration for UAS and prohibited operational aspects such as flight below certain altitudes, the judge in that case found that those ordinances did conflict with the FAA's rules or authority concerning UAS and throughout the city's ordinances. Now, that decision is limited to that jurisdiction. So the takeaway is that even though there may be many state and local laws out there that are questionable in their validity, you still do have to comply with them. And you do need to be aware that many of those state and local laws carry with them some pretty severe penalties. For example, in North Carolina, if you interfere with a manned aircraft with a UAS, that is a felony. And in certain states like Florida, for example, they actually have a statutory right where any party that's aggrieved by a individual who violates the state's UAS laws has a statutory right of action to sue that individual who is operating the UAS for monetary damages. So the takeaway here is that if you're going to be operating a UAS, whether it's for hobby or recreational use or under Part 107, you really do need to be familiar with not only any federal or state or federal laws, but also your state or local laws. And in that regard, many of those state and local laws are available online, so you can find them on your own. However, if you are going to be operating frequently or if you're just simply unfamiliar or uncertain, you may want to contact a local attorney for some assistance in understanding all the applicable rules.
All right, thanks, Jared. Very interesting how much that can vary from state to state. Justin, what can you tell us about what the FAA is doing with their Drone Advisory Committee?
Yeah, and I think Jared gave a great overview of kind of the landscape right now, and you have all these different kind of patchwork of state and local laws that exist, and you know, we're really worried, and I think there's a lot of concern out there in the industry about how these are going to affect the ability for UAS operators to expand their operational capabilities, because that's the main thing that everyone's talking about. And the big one is obviously beyond visual line of sight, and if you cross over jurisdictional boundaries, you know, you're getting into this, well, I may be compliant in one jurisdiction, but then I get into another, and then it's a problem. So this is going to become more important as we move forward and as the technology grows. The Drone Advisory Committee has been something that AOPA has been actively participating in. There's one task group within it that we've been involved in, which is studying the roles and responsibilities of state and local and the federal government in this area. How can we all play a role, and what role should we play to regulate these UAS operations so that they are being safely conducted and that we're not impeding manned aircraft as well. So, and I think, you know, after all of these discussions that we've had, I think there is a growing sense that the local governments, state governments, they have interests, they have legitimate needs that need to be protected, and that there is a role for them to play here. I mean, you look at reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, that's kind of the coined term here. You know, City of San Francisco wants to be able to put a certain flight restriction over a parade that they have, a very local parade, a certain parameters. How can they do that without impeding someone's ability to fly and do their package delivery or some other operation that they want to do? So we're really trying to find the right collaborative process where we can get all these groups involved and on the same page. One thing that has been going on also in Congress is various legislation that would give state and local governments more control over operations at low altitude, so below 200 feet. It would give them certain powers and various things. It hasn't really gone anywhere, though, because of the ATC debate and everything that's going on with that. But one thing that has gained a lot of traction right now is the UAS Integration Pilot Program. So this pilot program was signed last week by President Trump. It was rolled out recently, and the program basically allows state and local governments to partner with private UAS operators to conduct certain advanced UAS operations, so package delivery, counter UAS, some spectrum-related things, beyond visual line of sight. Really, it gives an opportunity for people to be creative in this area, and they would apply to the FAA, and the FAA would be responsible for overseeing the entire program. There's gotten quite a bit of an excitement, various stakeholders. It's going to provide some good data on how we can create this collaborative environment so that we're making sure everyone's interests are protected, while also making sure that the FAA retains control over the entire airspace system, that manned folks aren't going to be threatened in any way, and everything like that. So a lot of exciting things in this area, and stay tuned.
Yeah, thanks for that great recap, both of you. Sounds like things are evolving quickly in that area. We're going to be right back with you after a quick break sponsored by AOPA's Pilot Protection Services. Keep in mind you can ask questions in the live chat during the original broadcast of this webinar. We'll be right back with you.
I was going to use the plane for business purposes. When I was dealing with Pilot Protection Services, and I knew I had an attorney on the phone, it was one thing, but when I knew I had an attorney and a CPA, it was another thing. The gentleman walked me through the legalities and the accounting ramifications of all three types of companies that this airplane would be in, whether it was private, in my company, or in a new LLC.
Welcome back from the break. Keep in mind you can ask questions in the live chat through the original broadcast of this webinar. We're back now to talk about FAA enforcement. Jared Allen's going to walk us through how the FAA finds out about certain things and how they conduct those investigations as they relate to UAS. Jared, what can you tell us about that?
Well, Chad, you mentioned how does the FAA initially find out about a potential issue. And so let's just talk about that for a moment, because this is a hot topic at the Legal Services Plan. And quite frankly, there's three main ways that we find that the FAA learns of a potential issue involving an unmanned aircraft, whether it's hobby or recreational or commercial use. And the first, of course, is social media. So whether that's YouTube or posting to Facebook, you do have to be aware that as a UAS operator, Once you take that video and post it on the internet, it's going to be out there for everyone to see. And even if your operation is conducted in accordance with all the rules and regulations, sometimes those videos can be taken out of context. They may not understand what you were doing or what you were not doing, for example. So the first thing to keep in mind is that think twice before you put something out onto social media, because the FAA is out there. They may see that video, and while they are not going to base their entire case off of that video, it is very possible that is going to at least get them interested in what you are doing or not doing. So that's number one. The second most common way that we find the FAA learning of UAS issues is from local law enforcement. So an important thing to keep in mind is that the FAA has recognized that local law enforcement is in many cases much better equipped to do things like interview witnesses or gather evidence concerning UAS operations than the FAA is. And quite frankly, local law enforcement is usually the first one called if a member of the general public is complaining about a UAS. We see that very often with low UAS flights, for example. The local authorities will show up and then gather as much evidence as they can. They, of course, are looking for any violations of any state or local laws, like we were talking about earlier. But we frequently see those local law enforcement entities then notify the local FAA offices that there was an issue involving UAS, and does the FAA want to investigate it? So you may, in those cases, not only find yourself the subject of state or local violations, but also an FAA enforcement action. And we'll talk about those a little bit more in a moment. And the third area that you may catch the attention of the FAA or the NTSB for that matter is the most unfortunate cases where you have an accident or an incident. And those, of course, involve potential investigations for personal injury or property damage. Now, for those Part 107 operators out there, keep in mind that there are notification requirements under Part 107, and so you, in fact, are going to be obligated to inform the FAA of events that do meet what's outlined in the regulations, so do be aware of that. Now, when the FAA does become aware of an event and they investigate it, their most typical course of action is to contact the individuals involved, and the most common way that's done is through certified mail by sending what's called a letter of investigation. Now, these letters will often provide a very brief summary that the FAA is investigating a potential deviation or violation concerning a certain operation on a particular date and time. Now, the most important thing for anyone on the receiving end of one of these letters to understand is that you are not obligated to respond to it, and that anything you do send to the FAA, whether it's by mail or by contacting the inspector who sent the letter by telephone, is that anything you say can be used against you. So it's very important to consider how you respond to that letter, if at all. Now, when it comes to the potential actions the FAA can take if they are able to establish a violation of any federal aviation regulation or other requirement, it really depends upon the type of operator that you are. So, for example, for those hobby and recreational drone operators out there, you don't hold any FAA certificate. So the FAA can't suspend or revoke anything because you don't hold it. So the most common thing we see is the FAA assessing what's called a civil penalty, which is basically a fine. And those can be anything from several $100s to several $1,000s per individual. So they can have very severe consequences. For those individuals who are operating under Part 107, the most common or likely sanction would be the FAA suspending or perhaps revoking your remote pilot certificate. So that is obviously something to be concerned about, because if you're depending on that Part 107 certificate for your livelihood, obviously losing that's going to be an issue.
Certainly.
Absolutely. And so also on that topic, if you are an individual who, let's say either you're a hobby recreational user and you also happen to hold a airman certificate issued under Part 61 for manned aircraft, the FAA has already stated that even though you may not be exercising the privileges of that certificate while you're out flying your drone for hobby recreational use, the fact that you do hold that pilot certificate is an aggravating factor, meaning you should know better because you were a pilot and you should have taken, or you should have known to taken better precautions to comply with the regulations. And there have been some cases, at least, where a individual who was operating a UAS did have their pilot certificate suspended because of what they were doing with the UAS. And I believe most of those cases involve improper commercial operations, but it is something to certainly be aware of.
Thanks,
Jared,
Jed.
let me ask you a question. So as a Part 61 pilot and a CFI myself, certified flight instructor, and a 107 operator, if I'm going out and flying a 107 operation myself, and let's say, gosh forbid, something happens, and I have an airspace violation, could the FAA come after my Part 61 and my CFI certificate?
It's possible, but now it's really going to depend upon the violation involved. For example, if we're talking about, let's take the worst case scenario where maybe some paperwork wasn't filled out correctly, or in a case where a pilot may not put the correct information on a required FAA form. Well, in that case, the FAA could allege what's called intentional falsification and revoke all the pilot certificates and medical certificates and any FAA certificate that you hold, and certainly that's going to be a broad sweeping effect. Now, for something like an operational violation, let's say if you're flying under Part 107 and you accidentally fly into airspace without an authorization, is it likely that the FAA is going to pursue action against your pilot certificate? It's hard to say. It's possible. They could, but I would anticipate that they're going to limit their sanctions to your Part 107 certificate. On the other hand, if we're talking about an operational violation that could fall into the category of careless or reckless operation, then I think that pilot certificate could be in jeopardy, because there you're really talking about an individual who may lack the judgment and care to hold those certificates. So there's a lot of possibilities, and the important thing to know is that you are at risk, for all of your certificates whenever you're out there operating, even if you're not operating that particular type of.
So plan my mission accordingly.
Absolutely, and also on that note, keep in mind NASA reports. That's something we've preached upon very often in the manned aircraft world for decades, and there's nothing that prevents a Part 107 remote pilot from filing a NASA report either. So for those of you out there who may not be familiar with them, these are called NASA Aviation Safety Reporting System reports. There's a lot of information out there on them, and certainly you can ask questions and contact us at the Legal Services Plan if you have any questions about that.
Thanks, Jared. That's certainly something to look out for in terms of protecting your certificates. I wanted to ask, are we seeing the FAA apply their compliance philosophy in the world of UAS?
So the FAA's compliance philosophy is an approach that was rolled out in about late 2015, and what it focuses on is education and training in the event of possible pilot deviations or violations. So in the past, where we would see the FAA automatically pursue a suspension of the pilot certificate for some sort of alleged wrongdoing, now they take more of a what they call a approach to return the airman to compliance by providing either education or perhaps providing some training, or even just sitting down with the inspector and having them give you some consultation about what you can do to return yourself to compliance or prevent making those types of mistakes in the future. So the compliance philosophy applies to all certificate holders, including Part 107 certificate holders, but the key to this whole approach is that it does have to be an unintentional violation or deviation. It can't be something you did intentionally, and if it's a criminal act or something of that nature where there's aggravating circumstances, you may find yourself the subject of an enforcement action rather than a compliance action, as they call it. And I'll also just note that there's one other possibility whenever the FAA may suspect that you, as a Part 107 remote pilot, perhaps do not hold the qualifications to hold that certificate. And that is what's called, in brief, a 709 reexamination. And what that entails is the FAA's ability to ask you, or require you, as the remote pilot, to basically demonstrate your qualifications to hold your certificate. Now, this is a developing area, but what that should mean is that the FAA is requiring you to retake the knowledge test, because that's really all you needed to do in order to receive your Part 107 certificate. And the important takeaway here is that if you're ever the subject of an FAA investigation and an FAA inspector tells you that you need to come down to the local office with your UAS and demonstrate for that inspector or anyone at the FAA how you operate your UAS, you may not be necessarily required to do that, even though Part 107 does have a regulation that does allow the FAA to make certain inspections of your UAS. There's nothing that necessarily requires you as a remote pilot to demonstrate for that FAA inspector your operations. So just keep that in mind, and certainly if you find yourself in one of those situations, you're probably going to be best served by contacting an attorney.
Thanks, Jared. That's good advice. Speaking of contacting an attorney, next up we're going to discuss how you can protect yourself through AOPA's legal services plan either as a certificated remote pilot or as a hobbyist.
All right, Chad. Well, we'll try to make this as little of a sales pitch as possible, but I will add that if I sell a few more of these enrollments in the legal services plan, I get a free toaster. So the big takeaway here with the legal services plan is that we've got two main categories, and that's basic level protection, and that's going to really apply to those individuals out there who are operating for hobby or recreational use and, let's say, are concerned about having a civil penalty or a fine assessed against them, or they're an individual who holds a private pilot certificate and also enjoys flying UAS for hobby or recreational purposes, and they're concerned, hey, if I'm out there and I get myself into trouble, is my manned pilot certificate going to be in jeopardy? And like we've talked about, it's a possibility. That's what our basic level legal services plan protection is for. For those out there who operate under Part 107, we have the plus level, and that's required for anyone who's operating commercially. And really what you're going to be provided protection for are FAA enforcement actions that could either be for the suspension of your certificate or for the assessment of a civil penalty. We also provide consultation in the event of accidents. Also, there is coverage if you are asked to take an alcohol or drug test in connection with your UAS activities. So it's really having the ability for really any aviation-related legal matter to pick up the phone and at the very least be able to contact us here at AOPA and get some initial consultation about what you are required to do or what your options are, so you're not out there by yourself dealing with the FAA.
Thanks, Jared. That sounds like a great resource. But of course, the Legal Services Plan and Pilot Protection Services is not the only resource that AOPA has for remote pilots. We also have a drone pilot membership, and Kat Swain's going to tell us a little bit more about that.
Thanks for that, Chad. Yes, in February of this year, we actually launched and went into the drone space. So like I said, we've been in the drone space for quite a long time, helping with the implementation of 107. However, to really provide those benefits and services that we've historically been known to do for the manned aviation world to the unmanned aviation world, we started that in February. So like we've been talking about, the legal services plan has been one of the great additions onto the drone membership that you can add on. However, there's a whole list of additional benefits that you can have in the drone membership around news, around advocacy, around safety and education. We just finished rolling out our Intro to Part 107 seminars out to the flight school community, and those have been very well received. Flight school community is welcoming the UAS community to the flight school so that those CFIs can help teach airspace, charts, and so forth to those interested people out there, as well as doing drone experience events at all of our fly-ins and shows and providing extra education and safety materials to them. And Justin, I know we talked a lot about advocacy here today. What is going on in DC in the advocacy world?
Yeah, the advocacy part of this is really important. We obviously are on numerous groups that go on in DC, trying to come up with consensus-based recommendations and proposals for implementing and expanding operations for UAS operators. So the biggest one, obviously, that most people probably have heard about is the Drone Advisory Committee. We've been looking at, again, the roles and responsibilities of the various state and local governments, looking at ways on how the FAA can expand operational capabilities. Also looking at potential long-term funding mechanisms for a lot of the work the FAA is putting into this area. We're also on other groups, Unmanned Aircraft Safety Team, which is really looking at non-regulatory ways that normal operators can improve the safety of the NAS, operate safely, and make sure that they aren't causing any issues with manned aircraft or anyone else in the airspace. And there's actually some pretty neat things going to be coming out of that I think people are going to be pretty excited about. So those are the few of the groups that we were part of. There's numerous rulemaking committees that happen, that prop up, that we've been a part of. Registration was one. The small UAS rulemaking committee was another. Most recently, the UAS ID and tracking arc, which gets into addressing some of the security concerns that the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security have raised. So there's numerous things out there that we're involved in, and we really do have a voice in DC, and really trying to make sure that we are safely integrating and expanding these operations into the NAS.
All right, well, thank you, Justin and Kat, for breaking all that down for us. That's going to conclude our discussion for tonight. Thank you all for joining us tonight for Drones in the Legal Landscape. We covered a lot of ground here, and this is a rapidly evolving area, so stay tuned for future webinars. You can subscribe through YouTube to our channel, and feel free to reach out to us. Our live chat is going to be ending now, but keep in mind you can always call in with questions. We're open 8:30 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday. You can also reach us aopa.org/drones, drones at aopa.org for the drone team, and 800-872-2672. You can also reach the Pilot Protection Services side, aopa.org/pps. It's the same number starting off, 800 USA AOPA. Medical is extension 3, legal is extension 4. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for future webinars.